I found my sister's diary after she died. What I read changed everything I knew about my family. I was 63 years old when I sat on the floor of Margaret's bedroom and saw a tiny hospital bracelet with my name on it lying before me. In that moment, my heart stopped. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely hold that small pink piece of plastic. The label read, Baby Girl Johnson, and the date, my birth date. Next to it lay an old leather diary. I opened it with trembling fingers, and the first entry was dated exactly 9 months before I was born. My head started spinning. The world began to whirl. I thought I was going to be sick. In that moment, my life split into before and after. Before, when I was Susan Johnson, Margaret's younger sister. After, when I realized I had been living the biggest lie of my life for the past 63 years. Every time I drove up to that familiar white house with blue shutters, I would sit in my car and cry. How do you pack up an entire life? How do you decide what's worth keeping and what should go to charity? Finally, in November, when the first snow had already dusted the porch, I gathered the courage and went inside. The house smelled like Margaret, her favorite white lilac perfume, and the lavender soap she used to wash bed linens. I stood in the hallway and sobbed, knowing that this scent would soon disappear, and with it would vanish the last connection to the woman who had been the center of my world. I decided to start with her bedroom. The room was immaculately clean, as always with Margaret. The bed was made with an antique patchwork quilt that our grandmother had sewn. On the dresser stood family photos, Mom and Dad on their wedding day, Margaret and me as children, my kids at various ages. I picked up a picture where I was about 5 and Margaret was 12. She's hugging me from behind, and there's such an expression of protection and tenderness on her face that I had taken for ordinary sisterly love. Now I know it was something completely different. The dresser drawers were organized with Margaret's typical neatness. Underwear folded in neat stacks, socks rolled into tidy balls. But when I got to the bottom drawer of the nightstand, my fingers found something unexpected. In the very back corner, a wooden jewelry box about the size of a thick book, dark wood, looked like cherry, with an ornate brass lock. It was heavier than it appeared, and when I shook it, something quietly shifted inside. The sound wasn't like jewelry, more muffled, like paper. I searched the entire house for a key, but never found one. Finally, I took the box to the kitchen and carefully worked the lock with a butter knife. The old mechanism didn't give way immediately, but when I finally opened the lid, inside I discovered items that would turn everything I knew about my life upside down. Wrapped in yellowed tissue paper lay 3 objects. The first made my heart skip a beat. A hospital bracelet for newborns, tiny, pink, with faded letters. I picked it up with trembling fingers and read, Baby Girl Johnson. And under the name, a date I knew by heart, my birth date, September 15th, 1960. My head started buzzing. Why would Margaret keep my hospital bracelet? Why was it hidden in a secret box? And why did it say Baby Girl Johnson instead of Baby Susan? The second item made me sit right down on the kitchen floor. A black and white photograph. It showed a very young girl in a hospital bed, holding a tiny newborn. The girl looked exhausted, but her face was glowing with happiness. She was looking at the baby with such an expression of pure, boundless love that it took my breath away. The girl was Margaret. I'm pregnant. Oh my God, I'm pregnant. I'm 16 years old and I'm pregnant. It's been 8 weeks since my last period, and every morning I'm so nauseous I can barely make it to the bathroom. What am I going to do? In our town, this means the end of everything. Reputation, future, my entire life. If Mom and Dad find out, they'll kill me. Or worse, they'll throw me out of the house. I read these lines and felt like someone was knocking all the air out of me. Margaret was pregnant at 16? How is this possible? Why had I never heard about this? The next entry was made 2 weeks later, March 1st, 1960. I can't hide it anymore. Mom started noticing that I haven't been eating breakfast for the 3rd week straight. Last night, she came up to me while I was washing dishes and quietly said we needed to talk. My heart almost stopped. I thought she would scream, cry, maybe even hit me. But Mom just sat down next to me and took my hand, asked who the father was. I told her the truth. Tommy doesn't know. He left for the army in January, not even suspecting what was happening. Mom nodded and said that maybe it was better that way, that some secrets need to be kept for everyone's good. Tommy? Who was Tommy? I had never heard Margaret mention a boyfriend with that name. In the school yearbooks she kept, I had seen photos of graduating classes, but I never asked about her romantic relationships. It seemed like Margaret had always been too serious for teenage crushes. I turned the page, and the next entry made me gasp. March 8th, 1960. My parents made a decision. Mom and Dad talked behind closed doors for a long time, then called me into the living room. I was preparing for the worst, but instead, they told me about a plan. I would go to Aunt Ruth in Des Moines for the last months of pregnancy, officially to help her recover after gallbladder surgery. When the baby is born, we'll come back home, and everyone will think it's a late-in-life baby for Mom. I'm 42, Mom said. Everyone will believe it's an unexpected gift from God, and you'll be the loving big sister. When she said that, my heart broke in half. I put down the diary and pressed my hands to my chest. The pain was physical, as if someone had plunged a knife into my ribs. Margaret was my mother, my sister, who raised me, cared for me, loved me all my life, was actually my mother. And Mom, Helen, whom I had always considered the dearest person in the world, was my grandmother. Dad, Robert, was my grandfather. My entire family history was a lie, carefully constructed to protect the family's reputation and give me a normal life. But the most painful realization came later. Margaret had sacrificed her right to be a mother for my well-being. I forced myself to continue reading, though every line caused pain. May 20, 1960. I read books about babies and motherhood, though I know I won't need this knowledge, or I'll need it differently. The following entries were painful to read. Margaret described how her love for the unborn child grew, how she dreamed of teaching me to walk, talk, read. She bought baby things, which she then hid so Aunt Ruth wouldn't see how attached she was getting. August 25th, 1960. Contractions started at night. Aunt Ruth drove me to the hospital where Dr. Peter Miller was waiting for us. He knows the truth. Dad arranged everything with him in advance. Labor was long and painful, but when the doctor placed her on my chest, all the pain disappeared. She's perfect. Tiny fingers that immediately grabbed my finger. Gray eyes like Dad's, dark hair like mine. I named her Susan Helen Johnson. Helen after Mom, who will now become her mom. I sobbed reading these lines, imagining 16-year-old Margaret holding me in her arms, and knowing she would have to give me up was unbearably painful. September 1st, 1960. The hardest day of my life. Mom and Dad came to take Susie. When the nurse took her from my arms and handed her to Mom, I thought I would die from the pain. Mom held my daughter and smiled, but I could see tears in her eyes. She also understood how hard this was. Dad couldn't look at me. Too painful. Before leaving the hospital, I asked them to take one photograph, as a memory of the only day when I was truly her mother. October 15th, 1960. We came home. All the neighbors come to congratulate Mom on the newborn. Mrs. Peterson brought a casserole and said it's a miracle to give birth at 42. Mr. Harris from the grocery store gave us a box of baby food. Everyone admires the little angel and praises Mom for being so brave. And I stand nearby, smile and say how happy I am to be a big sister. Inside, my heart breaks into a million pieces every time someone calls my daughter my sister. The next entries covered my childhood. Every holiday, every milestone, every important moment was documented through the eyes of a woman who loved me as a mother, but was forced to pretend to be a sister. December 24th, 1960, Susie's first Christmas. She's so tiny in the red dress Mom knitted. When I hold her, she stops crying and looks at me with her gray eyes. Mom says it's coincidence, but I know better. She recognizes my voice, my smell. The bond between mother and child doesn't disappear just because it has to be hidden. June 3rd, 1963. Susie said her first word, Mama, but she was looking at me when she said it. I quickly picked her up, pointed to Mom and repeated, Mama, that's right, that's Mama. Mom smiled, but I noticed her eyes fill with tears. She understands how hard it is for me to hide the truth, but we have no choice. I couldn't contain my sobs reading these entries. To imagine Margaret hearing me call her Mama for the first time and being forced to redirect that word to another person. She looked like a princess in her white dress with lace sleeves. Got a scholarship to the University of Iowa, my smart girl. When they announced her name as valedictorian, I was so proud I thought my heart would explode with happiness. I wanted to stand up and shout, "That's my daughter, my amazing, talented daughter." But I could only applaud and smile like a proud big sister. October 12th, 1982, Susie's wedding. John is a good man, kind, smart. He'll love and protect her. But when I was helping her get dressed in the morning, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely button her dress. She asked why I was crying. I said I was just happy for her. That was only half the truth. The other half was that I was giving my daughter to another man, and he would never know what treasure he was getting. The most painful were the entries about my children's births. March 22nd, 1985. David was born, my first grandson. Susie was in labor for 8 hours, and I paced the hospital corridor like a madwoman the whole time. When the doctor finally came out and said everything went well, I almost collapsed with relief. I held little David an hour after birth, looked at his perfect face, and saw our family features. My genes live in this beautiful boy. I'm a grandmother, but to everyone else, just a caring aunt. November 5th, 1987, Emily was born. Another granddaughter I'll love with all my heart while pretending to be an aunt. When Susie placed the baby in my arms, Emily opened her eyes and looked straight at me. In that moment, I felt the same connection I had with her mother 27 years ago. Love passes through generations, even when it has to be hidden. The following entries covered my adult life, my successes and failures, joys and sorrows, all seen through the eyes of a woman who was my secret mother. July 3rd, 1995. Susie's divorce. It hurts to see her so broken. John turned out not to be the man we thought he was. Affairs, lies, financial problems. Susie is holding up well for the kids' sake, but I can see how she's suffering. I call her every day, trying to support her however I can. I want to hug her and say, "Everything will be okay. Mommy is here. Mommy will protect you." But I can only be there as a sister and hope my love is enough. May 18th, 2010. David's wedding. Susie cried with happiness, watching her son marry a wonderful girl. And I cried watching her. My daughter had become such a wise, strong woman. She raised her children with such love and patience. Sometimes, I think she did better than I would have if I had raised her myself. Then the tone of the entries changed. They became darker, filled with fear and regret. February 14th, 2015. Got the diagnosis. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Dr. Wilson spoke carefully, but I understood the essence. Not much time left. Strange, but my first thought wasn't about death, but about Susie. Yesterday, she took my hand and said, "Margaret, you've always been more than a sister to me. You've been my guardian angel." If only she knew how right she is. But even without knowing the truth, she felt our connection. Maternal love doesn't disappear when it's hidden. March 15th, 2016. This might be my last entry. Getting weaker every day, but I want Susie to know I regret nothing. Yes, I gave up the right to be called her mother, but in return, I got something no less valuable, the chance to love her all my life without losing closeness. Many mothers lose connection with their children when they grow up, but I was always there for her. It was my choice, and I'm proud of it. I closed the diary with trembling hands and broke down crying. Margaret had died, taking with her a secret that would have changed everything if I had learned it earlier. But now, sitting on the kitchen floor of the house where I spent my childhood, I understood. She wasn't just keeping a secret. She was making a sacrifice every day for my happiness. My sister was my mother, the most loving, selfless mother imaginable. But I needed proof. The story seemed too incredible. The next morning, barely waiting for offices to open, I drove to the County Vital Records office. The clerk, an elderly woman in glasses, gave me a copy of my birth certificate. Everything looked normal. Parents, Helen Marie Johnson and Robert James Johnson. Place of birth, St. Mary's Hospital, Des Moines, Iowa. But that's where I noticed the first oddity. Why did Mom give birth to me in Des Moines when we lived in Cedar Falls? The cities are over 100 miles apart. Our town had its own hospital, where Margaret was born and where all our neighbors gave birth. I requested medical records from that time. What I discovered made my heart stop. The file indicated that the delivery was attended by Dr. Edward Miller, and listed as emergency contact was not a family from Cedar Falls, but one Ruth Parker from Des Moines. Aunt Ruth. My hands started shaking again, so the diary was telling the truth. I sat in my car for a long time, unable to decide on the next step. I needed to talk to someone who knew the truth. Aunt Ruth had died 5 years ago at the age of 91, but she had a daughter, my cousin Jennifer. Jennifer was 10 years older than me, and we were never particularly close. She lived in Des Moines, worked as a nurse at the same hospital where I was born. Over the years, we only saw each other at relatives' funerals. I dialed her number with trembling fingers. Jennifer answered after the third ring. Her voice sounded tired. She had been working the night shift. I explained that I was going through Margaret's belongings and found strange documents. But if my story was true, then maybe Mom had left some proof. 2 days later, I was driving to Des Moines on a familiar road, but with completely different feelings. As a child, Margaret and I often visited Aunt Ruth. Now I understood that for Margaret, these trips were pilgrimages to the place where she gave birth to me and gave me away. Jennifer met me at Aunt Ruth's house, an old Victorian mansion with a spacious porch. She looked shocked and confused. Overnight, she had managed to find something. We went into the living room where boxes of family documents were spread out on the table. Jennifer explained that after her mother's death, she had simply moved these boxes to the basement, not daring to sort through them. Too many memories, too painful. But last night, after our conversation, she went down to the basement and started searching. What she found finally confirmed the truth. A whole folder of letters from Margaret, written in the summer of 1960. In them, my 16-year-old mother described her condition, her fears, her hopes. "Dear Aunt Ruth," I read in a trembling voice, "thank you for agreeing to help us. I know how hard it is for you to lie to neighbors about the reason for my visit, but we have no choice. The baby deserves a normal life without shame and judgment." In another letter, Dr. Miller seems like a kind man. He promised everything would go quietly, without unnecessary questions. Dad has already arranged all the details with him. After birth, Mom will immediately take the baby, and I'll return to school as if nothing happened. But the most painful was a letter written after birth. "Aunt Ruth, I don't know how to survive this. When the nurse took Susie from my arms and gave her to Mom, it felt like I was being torn in half. How can you live knowing that somewhere nearby is your child, but you can't be her mother? Mom says it will get easier with time." I hope she's right. Jennifer also found medical documents. A certificate stating that patient Margaret Johnson successfully gave birth to a healthy girl weighing 7 pounds 1 ounce. A receipt from a baby goods store in the name of Ruth Parker. Stroller, crib, clothes for a newborn. And most astonishing, a birth certificate. Not my official one, but a draft that had somehow been preserved in Aunt Ruth's papers. It listed Margaret Johnson as the mother, father unknown. This document was crossed out and marked canceled. Jennifer looked at me with a guilty expression. "Mom was telling the truth all these years," she whispered. "And we thought she had dementia. We didn't believe her when she told stories about Margaret and the baby. It seemed like the ravings of a sick old woman. She told me that Aunt Ruth, in her final years, often cried, remembering that summer day in 1960. She said she had helped deceive everyone, including me, that I had the right to know the truth about my origins. I sent samples to a lab, though I no longer doubted the result. 2 weeks later came official confirmation. Margaret Johnson was my biological mother with 99.99% probability. I held this document in my hands and cried, not from grief, but from overwhelming gratitude. Margaret had sacrificed the most precious thing, her right to be a mother, to give me a better life. In 1960, an unwed teenage mother and her child would have faced such judgment that it would have destroyed our future. The family's reputation would have been ruined. Margaret would never have gotten a good education or found decent work. And I would have grown up with the stigma of being a child of sin, which in a small conservative town meant lifelong ostracism. Instead, I had a happy childhood in a loving family. I got an education, married a good man, had wonderful children. I had a full, successful life, not clouded by any shame. And all this time, Margaret was there. Now, knowing the truth, I began to re-examine all my memories of her. And I realized that the signs had always been there. I just didn't know how to read them. Margaret always appeared at the most important moments of my life. When I was 7 and fell off my bike, she was the first to run to me, checked for serious injuries, treated my scrapes. Mom was at home in the garden, but Margaret was by my side instantly, as if maternal instinct had told her about trouble. When as a teenager I had my first heartbreak over a boy, it was Margaret who sat with me all night, held my hand, said the right words. She had an amazing ability to understand my feelings without explanations. When I got married, Margaret helped me choose the dress, did my hair, adjusted my veil. I remember how she stood behind me at the mirror, and her hands trembled when she fastened the last buttons. I thought then that she was just nervous for me as an older sister. Now I understand. It was a mother preparing her daughter for the most important day of her life. During my children's births, Margaret was there from early morning. She paced the hospital corridor with my husband, looked more worried than any aunt should. And when the doctor finally announced a successful outcome, she cried with relief. Now I understand. Those were a grandmother's tears, who feared for her daughters' and grandchildren's lives. Margaret was present at every one of my children's birthdays, every school play, every graduation. She gave the most thoughtful gifts, always knew exactly what a child needed at any given age. She had intuitive wisdom that I attributed to her teaching experience. In reality, it was maternal and grandmotherly intuition. When I was getting divorced, Margaret called me every day, came to help with the children, supported me morally and financially. She was my main support during that difficult period. I thought I was just lucky with my sister. She cooked, cleaned, was just there when Emily needed to cry. Margaret told her then, the pain of loss never completely disappears, but the love you already felt for this child will stay with you forever. And when it's time for the next baby, this love will make you an even better mother. These were words from a woman who knew what it meant to lose a child. Margaret spoke from her own experience. She had lost me the day she gave me to my parents to raise. But her love truly never disappeared. I decided to tell my children the truth. I couldn't keep this secret anymore, especially knowing how much David and Emily loved Margaret. I started with David. We sat in his living room. I held Margaret's diary in my hands, and with trembling voice, retold the entire story. David first couldn't believe it, then was shocked, and finally broke down crying. "Mom," he said, "this explains so much. Aunt Margaret always knew what to say to us in difficult moments. She had some special wisdom, maternal intuition. Now I understand why. She was our grandmother." Emily reacted similarly. First shock, then understanding, then tears of gratitude. "She loved us in a special way," Emily said. "Now I know why. We were her grandchildren, and she could express maternal love through us, even though she couldn't be a mother openly." We went to the cemetery together. I brought Margaret's diary and read the last entry aloud at her grave. I spoke to her as the mother she had always been. Margaret, I know now. I know what incredible sacrifice you made for my happiness. I know how you loved me all your life without having the right to call yourself mom. Thank you for giving me a wonderful life. Thank you for being the best mother in the world, even while hiding it. But the story didn't end there. It was just beginning. A month after visiting the cemetery, I made a decision that changed our lives even more. I decided to find my biological father. In Margaret's diary, she mentioned Tommy several times, a young man who went to the army without knowing about the pregnancy. I found his last name in Margaret's 1960 school yearbook. Thomas Tommy Collins, same year graduate. Internet searches turned out easier than I expected. Thomas Collins, 78 years old, Vietnam War veteran, lived in Chicago, was married for 40 years, widowed 2 years ago, 3 adult children, 7 grandchildren. I agonized for a week about whether to call him. What if he didn't want to stir up the past? What if news of a daughter he never knew about would disrupt his peaceful old age? But eventually, curiosity overcame fear. I dialed the number with trembling fingers. A pleasant male voice with a slight Chicago accent answered. I introduced myself and said I was calling from Cedar Falls, Iowa. Tommy immediately perked up. He hadn't heard that town's name in 50 years. He went to school there, he said, before being drafted. He said he had a daughter he didn't know about for 63 years, that Margaret was pregnant when he left and never told anyone. Tommy asked permission to meet me, said this could be the most important day of his life. A week later, I was flying to Chicago with a bag full of documents, photos, and Margaret's diary. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure my fellow passengers could hear it. Tommy met me at the airport. Tall, gray-haired man with kind brown eyes and a familiar smile. I saw the resemblance immediately. Same chin, same hands, same way of tilting his head slightly when listening. We hugged right there in the airport, and I felt like I had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle. Tommy drove me to his house, a cozy home in a Chicago suburb where he had lived for the past 40 years. On the way, he told me about his life. After the RE, he went to college on the GI Bill, studied engineering, met his future wife Caroline at a dance in 1965. They married, moved to Chicago, where he got a job with a construction company, had 3 children, Michael, Patricia, and Robert. Caroline died of cancer 2 years ago, and Tommy was having a hard time with the loss. The children live with their own families. Grandchildren visit on weekends. An ordinary American family. Nothing remarkable, except that all these years, it was missing one person, me. At home, Tommy showed me photo albums. His wedding to Caroline, a beautiful blonde with kind eyes. The children's births, family vacations, birthdays, graduations, an entire life that could have been mine too, if circumstances had been different. But the most amazing discovery awaited me. Tommy told me he had thought about Margaret his whole life, couldn't forget that winter night in 1959 when they first kissed on her house's porch, couldn't forget her laugh, her intelligent eyes, her dreams of going to college. When he returned from Vietnam in 1968, the first thing he did was drive to Cedar Falls. He wanted to find Margaret, explain himself, maybe even marry her. but he learned that she had already graduated from college and was working as a teacher, and she had a younger sister whom she adored. Tommy decided then that it was too late to stir up the past. Margaret had arranged her life. He had no right to destroy it. He returned to Chicago, met Caroline, started a family. But from time to time, he still made inquiries about Margaret. He learned that she never married, devoted herself to teaching and caring for her family. This surprised him. Margaret was beautiful, smart, kind. Why hadn't she chosen anyone? Now he understood why. Margaret had kept his secret and was raising their shared daughter without even being able to tell him about it. That evening, we talked until late into the night. Michael, the eldest, worked as a cardiac surgeon at one of Chicago's hospitals. A serious, focused man, very much like his father. When Tommy told him the story, Michael first didn't believe it, then was shocked, and then hugged me with tears in his eyes. "I have an older sister," he kept repeating. "All my life I was the oldest child, and it turns out I have an older sister." Patricia worked as an elementary school teacher. Like Margaret, an amazingly kind woman with a gentle character and a maternal heart. She said Dad had always told them about a girl from his youth whom he could never forget. Now they understood why. Robert, the youngest, served in the fire department. A big, strong man with a sense of humor and open heart. He immediately announced that he was throwing a family barbecue in my honor, and everyone had to come meet the new aunt. Aunt, for the first time in my life. Someone was calling me aunt, not by mistake. I suddenly had nephews and nieces I never knew existed. On the weekend, the entire Collins family gathered at Robert's house. His wife, Maria, a Mexican woman with sparkling eyes, cooked traditional dishes. Children ran around the yard. My great-nephews and great-nieces, who curiously examined their new relative. Michael brought his family, his doctor wife, and 2 teenagers. Patricia came with her husband and 3 children. Suddenly, I was surrounded by more than 20 new relatives. But the most touching moment happened when Tommy stood up with a glass in his hand and made a toast. 63 years ago, he said in a trembling voice, I lost the 2 most precious people in my life without even knowing it. Margaret, whom I loved, and a daughter whose existence I never suspected. Today I can't bring Margaret back, but I found Susan. And through her I feel a connection to the woman who always remained in my heart. Everyone cried, including me. In that moment, I understood that family isn't just those who raised you, but also those who accept you with open arms when they learn the truth. But the story of my discoveries didn't end there. A week later in Chicago, Tommy suggested we go to Iowa together. He wanted to visit Margaret's grave, pay his last respects, ask forgiveness for not knowing the truth. We flew to Des Moines, rented a car, and drove to Cedar Falls. Tommy was silent the whole way, looking out the window at the familiar places of his youth. The town had barely changed over the years. The same main street with small shops, the same school where Tommy and Margaret had studied, the same park where they walked on cold winter evenings in 1959. Tommy asked to first drive past the house on Maple Street. It stood empty. I still hadn't decided what to do with it. Tommy looked for a long time at the familiar windows, at the porch where he had once said goodbye to Margaret. Nothing has changed here, he said quietly. Tommy wanted to see where their daughter grew up, where Margaret had spent her entire life. We walked through the rooms, and I told him stories of our childhood. I showed him the bedroom where Margaret slept, The kitchen, where she made me breakfast before school. The living room, where she helped with homework. In my childhood bedroom, Tommy stopped at the window. From here, you could see the backyard where the old swing set stood that Dad had hung for me when I was 5. "She watched you from here," Tommy said quietly. "Every day when you played in the yard, she stood at this window and watched her daughter. But she couldn't come up and hug you as a mother." His words broke my heart. I imagined young Margaret standing at this window, watching me and dreaming of being close, not as a sister, but as a mom. In the closet, I showed Tommy boxes of childhood things that Margaret had kept all her life. My first little shoes, dresses I wore to kindergarten, drawings I brought home from school. Usually, parents keep such things, but Margaret collected every little thing connected to me, like precious memories of the daughter she couldn't openly love. Tommy picked up my first school photo, a 6-year-old girl with 2 braids and a toothless smile. "She looks like you at that age," he said. "You have the same eyes, the same smile." In that moment, I realized something else. Tommy had also been sacrificing his whole life. He didn't know about my existence, but always felt he had missed something important. That's why he couldn't forget Margaret. That's why he made inquiries about her. That's why he told his children about the girl from his youth whom he never forgot. Subconsciously, he was searching for what he had lost, not knowing what exactly. We spent 3 days in Cedar Falls. Tommy met with old classmates who still lived in town. Many remembered him and Margaret as a high school couple. It was painful to hear everyone say they were perfect for each other, how surprising it was that fate had separated them. If only they knew how fate had actually connected them. Before leaving, Tommy made an unexpected decision. He bought the house on Maple Street. "I want to spend the rest of my life where Margaret lived," he explained, "where our daughter grew up. Here, I feel a connection to her that I lost 60 years ago." He sold his house in Chicago and moved to Cedar Falls. His children were initially concerned, "Why change your whole life at 78? But when they understood the reason, they supported their father. Over the past 6 months, I've gained not just a new relative, but an entire family. Tommy has become part of our lives. My children, David and Emily, have accepted him as the grandfather they never knew. But my grandchildren have changed the most. Helen and Robert, whom I called Mom and Dad, were also real family. They took responsibility for someone else's child and raised me with such love that I never felt unwanted or foreign. Tommy, who learned of my existence at 78, became family the moment he accepted me as a daughter, despite all the lost years. And my new brothers and sisters, nephews and nieces, accepted me into their circle so naturally, as if I had always been part of it. Today, almost a year after that day when I found Margaret's diary, I sit in the house on Maple Street and write this story. Outside the window, Tommy plays in the garden with my grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. David and Emily come every weekend, bring the children. The house is full of life again, laughter, family warmth. Margaret would be happy to see how her sacrifice led to the reunion of a family she never even dreamed of. On the table before me lie photographs, old pictures of our family, and new photos with Tommy's family. Past and present, secrecy and truth, loss and discovery. I've started keeping my own diary for future generations who should know this story. I want my grandchildren and great-grandchildren to understand love comes in different forms. Sometimes it looks like a mother openly raising children. Sometimes like a sister who will never leave. Sometimes like grandparents who took on parental responsibilities. And sometimes like a secret that's kept a lifetime to protect those you love. Margaret Johnson was all of this at once. She was proof that the deepest love doesn't need recognition or titles. It flourishes in silence, in daily care, in endless devotion. She taught me that motherhood isn't a biological function, but a state of the soul. That family isn't just those who gave you life, but those who filled that life with meaning. My sister died, but I found my mother. I lost an aunt for my children, but they gained the memory of a grandmother. I learned a truth that changed my past life, but built a new one, fuller and more meaningful. Sometimes the most important discoveries come to us when we least expect them. Sometimes the greatest gifts are hidden in small wooden boxes, waiting for their time. And sometimes the purest love lives in secrecy, protecting those we love from pain we're ready to bear ourselves. This is a story about such love. This is a story about Margaret, a woman who gave me life twice, once at birth, and a second time through her lifelong devotion. This is a story about how family doesn't always look the way we expect. But true love always finds a way to express itself, even if it means keeping the biggest secret for an entire lifetime. Tonight, Tommy and I will go to the cemetery again. We'll bring Margaret her favorite white roses and tell her about the grandchildren growing up in the house where she once lived. About the family that finally reunited thanks to her sacrifice.